In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where white picket fences and manicured lawns give an illusion of serenity, a sinister scheme unfolds. The Homeowners Association, HOA, wielding unchecked power, has long held residents under its oppressive thumb. At the helm of this tyrannical regime is Karen, a woman whose polished smile masks her ruthless ambition. James, a highly decorated U.S. Army general, had purchased a home in this neighborhood years ago. It was a sanctuary, a place of peace where he had envisioned retiring after decades of service. However, unbeknownst to him, while he was stationed overseas, the HOA had been plotting against him. Under the guise of community beautification, Karen and her husband, who held the title of HOA treasurer, orchestrated a devious plan to demolish James' home. They claimed that the property violated HOA guidelines and was an eyesore, even though it passed every inspection before James' deployment. Under the false pretense that the house was abandoned, Karen pushed through a demolition order without proper legal backing. With James thousands of miles away, unable to defend himself, the bulldozers arrived one morning, and within hours, the home was reduced to rubble. Neighbors watched in stunned silence, too fearful to intervene, as the structure crumbled into dust. They had seen what happened to those who challenged Karen's authority: fines, legal threats, and social ostracization. This was just another power move, another example of her unchecked dominance. Karen and her husband had built an empire within the HOA, turning what should have been a simple neighborhood organization into a vehicle for personal enrichment. Their scheme was insidious. They targeted homes owned by military personnel, exploiting the fact that these homeowners were often absent due to deployments. By fabricating violations and leveraging fraudulent tax liens, they orchestrated forced demolitions and property seizures. These properties, conveniently vacated, were then sold to developers for an exorbitant profit, funneled through shell companies connected to Karen's family. The residents had long suspected corruption, but lacked the means to fight back. Any dissent was swiftly met with retaliation, exorbitant fines for minor infractions, legal threats over arbitrary rule changes, and in extreme cases, sudden eviction notices backed by fabricated documents. The HOA's financial records were a labyrinth of deception, with hidden transfers and off-the-books transactions obscuring their misdeeds. For years, Karen and her husband had operated with impunity, using fear and manipulation to silence opposition. They counted on the fact that deployed service members wouldn't be able to react in time. But this time, they had miscalculated. James was not just any homeowner. He was a battle-hardened general who had spent his career dismantling threats far more dangerous than a corrupt HOA. James returned James' plane touchdown earlier than scheduled. He had planned a quiet return, looking forward to surprising his family. As he drove through his neighborhood, he felt a surge of anticipation. Until he reached his street. Where his home had once stood, there was nothing but a pile of rubble. His heart pounded. The weight of disbelief settled in his chest as he stepped out of his vehicle, eyes scanning the destruction before him. A neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Calloway, shuffled forward, his voice trembling. "James, son, I'm so sorry. They came 2 weeks ago. Karen said the house was abandoned. We tried to stop them, but..." He shook his head, his words faltering. James clenched his fists, his military training the only thing keeping his anger in check. He didn't need explanations, not yet. First, he needed answers, and Karen was going to give them to him. Karen was hosting a neighborhood improvement event when James stormed into the HOA office. The chatter of suburban elites died instantly as a towering figure the general entered, his uniform still crisp from travel. "James, what a surprise," Karen said, her voice laced with feigned innocence. "I didn't know you were back." "Cut the crap, Karen," James growled, slamming a thick folder of legal documents onto the desk. "Explain this." Karen's smug smile faltered as she glanced at the papers. The Service Member Civil Relief Act, SCRA, was explicitly referenced. Clear legal protections against exactly this kind of predatory action. Her fingers twitched as she attempted to compose herself. James, you have to understand. There were complaints." "Lies," James interrupted. "Every last one. And I have the proof." He gestured towards a folder, which detailed a web of fraudulent transactions, falsified inspections, and tax records that exposed Karen's entire operation. Karen's husband, who had been watching silently from the corner, took a step forward. "Now, let's not be hasty. Maybe we can work something out." James turned his steely gaze on him. "The only thing that's going to be worked out is how long you'll spend behind bars." The neighborhood had long been under Karen's thumb, but seeing James stand up to her ignited a long-dormant courage among the residents. One by one, they stepped forward with their own pieces of evidence: hidden tax payments, manipulated property values, and bogus violation notices that had forced families out of their homes. Local news stations picked up the story, and soon investigative journalists uncovered even more damning evidence. Interviews with former HOA board members revealed that Karen and her husband had siphoned off HOA funds for years, using them to finance their lavish lifestyle while enforcing arbitrary rules to justify their actions. The tipping point came when a group of homeowners banded together and filed a class action lawsuit. James, using his military connections, ensured that federal agencies got involved. The Department of Justice took interest due to the blatant violations of the SCRA, and soon a full-scale investigation was launched. Karen and her husband were arrested, their empire crumbling overnight. As they were led away in handcuffs, James stood at the front of the crowd, arms crossed, watching justice take its course. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood underwent a transformation. With Karen gone, the HOA was dissolved, replaced with a fair and transparent committee. James, with the help of local supporters, began the process of rebuilding his home. But more than that, he had helped his community reclaim their voice, proving that no amount of corruption could withstand the power of integrity and resilience. As he stood before the construction site, watching the first beams go up, James knew one thing for certain. This time, he was home for good. The downfall of Karen Holloway and the corrupt HOA didn't just shake Willow Creek. It sent shockwaves through the state. It started small. A local news reporter, intrigued by whispers of an illegal demolition scandal, arrived at the neighborhood to investigate. When she saw the wreckage of James Carter's home and heard from neighbors about the HOA's long history of corruption, she knew she had stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple case of abuse of power. Within 48 hours, the story went viral. National news networks picked it up, broadcasting images of James Carter. Standing tall in front of the ruins of his home, the American flag from his front porch half buried in the rubble. The headline: Decorated General returns from deployment to find his home illegally demolished by HOA corruption. Outrage spread across the country. Veterans groups, military advocacy organizations, and even high-profile figures took to social media, demanding justice. People from all walks of life, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, united in their disgust. The pressure mounted when Senator Evelyn Harper, a fierce advocate for military families, got involved. She publicly condemned the HOA's actions, calling it an unforgivable betrayal of those who risked their lives for this country. She vowed to push for a full federal investigation, ensuring that no military family would ever be targeted like this again. "This is not just about one man," she said in a live press conference. "This is about every soldier, every airman, every Marine, every sailor who has ever left home believing their country will protect them in return." The nation was watching, and Karen Holloway knew her time was running out. With the media firestorm and Senator Harper applying pressure, the FBI took immediate action. They started by subpoenaing HOA financial records. What they found was damning. Karen and her husband had been running an elaborate scheme for years, falsifying HOA violation notices, forging signatures, and manipulating local government officials to expedite demolitions. Their bank accounts revealed millions in unexplained deposits from shadowy real estate investors. Even more shocking, some of those investors had direct ties to powerful developers looking to seize land for commercial projects. The final nail in the coffin? A forensic accountant discovered that Karen had been funneling money through offshore accounts, laundering bribes under the guise of community improvement funds. The FBI, armed with overwhelming evidence, moved swiftly. At 6 a.m. on a quiet Tuesday morning, federal agents descended on the Holloway estate. Karen and Richard were still in their silk robes when the pounding on the door began. "Karen Holloway, Richard Holloway, this is the FBI. Open the door." Within minutes, the two were in handcuffs, their pristine reputation shattered beyond repair. as they were led into waiting black SUVs. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment for all to see. The mighty HOA tyrants had finally fallen. As the investigation deepened, an even more sinister revelation emerged. Richard Holloway, aside from being Karen's partner in crime, also owned a construction company, Holloway Development and Construction. It turned out that the demolitions weren't just random. They were calculated. Every home taken belonged to a military family, and every demolition site was part of a pre-planned blueprint for an ultra-luxury residential and commercial complex. The development plan had already been drafted. High-rise condos, upscale retail stores, private golf courses. And James Carter's land? It was supposed to be the site of a private clubhouse for high-end investors. The betrayal ran deep. When confronted with these findings, Richard attempted to deny everything. But investigators had already retrieved internal emails between him and his business partners, outlining the entire scheme. This isn't just fraud, one FBI agent commented. This is a systematic effort to exploit the very people who protect this country. It's sickening. As news of the contractor scandal broke, protests erupted outside City Hall. Residents demanded justice, not just for James, but for every military family who had been targeted. Karen Holloway had spent years bending the law to her will. Even behind bars, she refused to go down without a fight. With her high-powered attorneys, she filed a last-minute legal motion claiming that the demolitions were legally sanctioned under a rarely used zoning loophole. She insisted that because the HOA had issued multiple warnings about the supposed violations, the demolition was technically justified. Her strategy was clear: muddy the waters, delay the trial, and hope public outrage would die down. But James Carter and his team were ready. Working with Senator Harper's legal advisors, they presented irrefutable evidence: fraudulent records, forged signatures, and manipulated zoning approvals. They even brought in former city employees who admitted under oath that they had been pressured into fast-tracking demolition permits. Karen's case crumbled in real time. The judge, disgusted by the blatant fraud, dismissed her motion with a scathing rebuke. This court will not entertain the desperate attempts of a criminal trying to evade accountability, he declared. The evidence is clear. The harm is real, and justice will be served. Karen sat silently as the verdict was read, the weight of her downfall finally sinking in. In the wake of the scandal, Willow Creek faced a choice: remain divided in fear or come together to heal. The decision was clear. Led by veterans organizations and local volunteers, a massive effort began to rebuild James Carter's home from the ground up. Donations poured in from across the country: building materials, furniture, even landscaping supplies. Skilled workers offered their services for free. Day by day, brick by brick, the home rose again. But this wasn't just about one house. It was about restoring trust, dignity, and a belief that justice still mattered. On the day of completion, James Carter stood in front of his new home, surrounded by hundreds of neighbors, veterans, and well-wishers. A local pastor led a short prayer, and then Senator Harper took the stage. "This home is more than wood and nails," she said. "It is a symbol of what happens when good people refuse to be silenced, when justice triumphs over corruption, and when a community stands together." James, a man who had spent his life defending others, felt an unfamiliar lump in his throat. He took the microphone, scanning the crowd, many of whom had once been too afraid to speak out. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just rebuild my home. You rebuilt something much greater, and I will never forget it." As the American flag was raised once more in front of his home, the crowd erupted in applause. Willow Creek was no longer under the shadow of corruption. It was, at last, a community restored. The downfall of Karen Holloway was more than just a personal victory for James Carter. It was a wake-up call for the entire country. As news of the scandal spread, veterans advocacy groups and legal experts began highlighting a disturbing pattern. Military families across the nation had been targeted by corrupt HOAs, losing their homes to fabricated violations, shady fines, and legal loopholes. One man in particular took up the fight: Colonel Samuel Matthews, a retired Marine Corps officer who had experienced similar harassment from an HOA years ago. Matthews, now a fierce advocate for veterans' housing rights, knew this wasn't an isolated case. With the help of Senator Evelyn Harper and a coalition of veteran leaders, the Matthews Act was introduced in Congress. The legislation aimed to white heavy checkmark prohibit HOAs from taking action against military families while a homeowner is on active duty. White heavy checkmark require federal oversight of HOA demolitions and foreclosures involving veterans. White heavy checkmark established a legal defense fund for military families fighting unjust HOA rulings. White heavy checkmark imposed severe criminal penalties for HOA leaders found guilty of fraud or harassment. This isn't about a single community, Colonel Matthews said in a televised hearing. This is about protecting those who protect us. With public support at an all-time high and political pressure mounting, the Matthews Act passed in record time, ensuring that no military family would face what James had endured. The law bore the name of a fallen Marine, one of Matthews' closest friends, who had lost his home while deployed. And for James Carter, knowing his ordeal had led to real change was worth more than any court verdict. While the country celebrated the Matthews Act, Karen Holloway faced a much darker fate. Her world had collapsed, with multiple felony charges, including fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and illegal property seizures. Karen and her husband, Richard, were looking at decades behind bars. But it wasn't just the legal system that had turned against her. The community she once ruled with an iron fist now wanted nothing to do with her. Longtime allies cut ties overnight. Former friends refused to take her calls. The developers who once courted her for business pretended they had never met her. Worse yet, the HOA she controlled for years was completely dismantled by court order. The once feared organization was now under independent oversight, with new leadership chosen by the residents. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of Willow Creek, was now a disgraced outcast. Her mansion, paid for with the blood, sweat, and tears of hard-working families, was seized by the state to pay off legal damages. Everything she had stolen, every dirty dollar, every backdoor deal was exposed. The final blow came in court when the judge denied her bail and ordered her to remain in custody until trial. As she was led away in an orange jumpsuit, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, she had no more clever words, no more excuses. Her reign was over. Not everyone in the Holloway family was guilty. Karen's daughter, Lindsay Holloway, had spent most of her life under the shadow of her manipulative mother. Though she had distanced herself from the HOA years ago, she never fully realized the depth of Karen's corruption. Until now. Watching her mother's crimes unravel before the world was painful. But what haunted Lindsay the most was knowing that innocent families had suffered. Determined to make things right, she took a bold step, contacting James Carter. At first, he wasn't sure what to expect. But when Lindsay showed up at the community center with a box of salvaged items from his demolished home, James saw something different in her. Inside the box were his grandfather's medals, a collection of letters from his time in the service, and a pocket watch that had belonged to his father. "I know I can't undo what my mother did," Lindsay said, voice shaking. "But I want to help. If you'll let me." James studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Help the people she hurt. And she did. Lindsay donated every cent of her personal inheritance to veterans' charities. She volunteered for housing initiatives that helped military families get back on their feet. And, most importantly, she testified against her mother in court, ensuring justice was served. It wasn't about redemption. It was about doing what was right. After the dust settled, James Carter was faced with a decision. Developers still wanted his land. Even after the scandal, some companies offered millions to buy the property. But James had other plans. Instead of selling, he donated the land to a veteran housing project. With the help of nonprofit organizations and federal grants, his former property, once the target of corruption, became a sanctuary for those who had served. The Carter Veterans Community was built. House with Garden affordable homes for veterans in need. Hospital, a small medical center specializing in PTSD care. Military Medal, a memorial park honoring fallen servicemen and women. When the ribbon-cutting ceremony took place, hundreds gathered, including the same neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out. James, standing in front of the newly built homes, spoke with quiet pride. "They try to destroy something that mattered," he said. but we built something greater. The land was no longer a battleground. It was a beacon of hope, unity, and justice. For most of his life, James Carter had fought battles overseas. But now he had a new mission. Using his platform, he became a leading advocate for veterans' housing rights, launching Operation Homefront Justice, a nonprofit that helped military families fight corrupt HOAs and predatory real estate practices. His story inspired others to come forward, revealing similar HOA abuses in different states. James worked alongside lawmakers, activists, and veterans groups to dismantle corrupt housing policies that had gone unchecked for too long. "I spent my life fighting for this country," he said in a televised interview. "And now, I'm fighting for the people who serve it." His efforts led to white heavy checkmark more states adopting protections for military homeowners. White heavy checkmark laws requiring transparency in HOA financial dealings. White heavy checkmark new federal grants for veteran homeownership assistance. James Carter had lost a home, but in the end, he gained a purpose that would help thousands.